Hi, I'm Craig West, founder of Capitaliz, and today I'm going to take you through, as part of our video series, the Business Insights Report, the key piece of the toolkit that we use with every single client in Australia to work through a succession and exit planning. So firstly, let me help you understand why. Why are we doing a Business Insights Report? What's the purpose and what's the context? Firstly, in my experience, most business owners have absolutely no idea what their business is worth and why. What does that mean? Firstly, they don't know what the number is. They don't know if it's 2 million or 5 million or 10. Secondly, and probably even more importantly, they don't know how to move the needle on that valuation. So if the business is worth 5, it's a fait accompli, it's worth 5. Actually, that's not true. It's not about it's worth 5. It's about today it's worth 5, but it could be worth 6 or 8. And so the report covers that, and we'll go through how it does that in a moment. But from a context point of view, it's very important that business owners understand, what have I actually got here? What is my business worth? And what we always do is position it as if we were looking at it from a buyer, investor, or lender's point of view. If I'm a buyer looking at your business, what am I going to find? When I start to look at the financials, what am I going to uncover? When I look at all the non-financial operational sides of the business, what am I going to see there? What are the good things that I'm going to find out? But also, what are the things that are going to cause me to worry? What are the gaps, or what are the risks, or what are the issues that I may well think, yeah, it's not as attractive as it looked originally, or maybe it's not worth as much as I thought, because that's a real issue. For example, it might be completely dependent on the owner, and that's a risk that I'm probably not prepared to take. The second part then is, once we understand what we're trying to do with our client, it's all about education for them about their own business. And then opening up to them about what the options are therefore. What are you likely to be able to do with the business in terms of exit, given all the data that we now know? First step is to onboard the client, to bring them into the system, to collate all the data. So step 2 of our 21-step process is actually called fact find. It's gathering all of the information that we need. Step 1's already about the goals and outcomes. What are you trying to achieve? And we can uncover that fairly early in the process, although sometimes it changes and morphs as things change over time. The second step though is onboarding and fact find. How do we get all the information we need? Now there's a couple of key things that the software will do for you. Firstly, we've got an integration with about 30 different accounting packages. So we can automatically import 3 or 4 years financials. If you don't use one of those accounting packages, then we can do it manually. We can actually data enter all of the financials. But we need 4 years financials, so we've got all of the history. Again, that's what a buyer will always look for. We often also ask for next year's budgets. If we're partway through a financial year, or we've just finished our accounts for last year and we've just started a new year, what's our budget look like? Are we growing? By how much? What's our profit figure going to look like? Or what are we expecting next year? So we've gathered the financial information either automatically through our integration or manually where we've had to type that data in, and it's fairly easy to type that in. The second thing we have to do then is normalize those figures. So we've got some financials. Most small businesses have got add backs and adjustments. Maybe they don't pay rent because they own the building. Maybe they don't pay themselves as an owner a market salary. Either they pay themselves far too much because they can, or they pay themselves just under a particular tax figure or a number that they're comfortable with, but it's not often a market salary, so we have to adjust that to get it back to a normalised figure. And then there might be some personal expenses or some non-business related expenses. Maybe there's a one-off legal case or some other event that's actually an unusual expense that we can add back or adjust out of the profit and loss. So we get a normalised P&L at the end of the day. The second part of the fact find is actually non-financial. And this is where we spend an hour and a half, 2 hours with the client talking through all of the operational side of the business. Now the software guides you through this. It will provide all of the questions. The questions are dynamic. So in other words, if you ask a client, do you have a board of directors? And the answer is yes, then it'll ask you some follow-up questions. How often do you meet? Have you got an independent director on the board? Is there a board reporting pack that's prepared? Etc. If you said, however, no, I don't have a board of directors, none of those questions will appear in the interview. They'll drop off because they're inappropriate, given that you haven't got a board anyway. So it's a dynamic questionnaire. There's about 150 questions, and it covers every single aspect of the non-financials of the business. How does the business operate? Who is it dependent on? Who are the key people? How are your people remunerated and paid? Is there an incentive plan or an employee ownership plan? What do your HR systems look like? What's your occupational work health and safety history look like? What does your insurance cover look like? How's your IT and cyber security managed? All of those aspects. And again, all through the lens of a buyer. All of the types of things that a buyer would typically want to know or ask about if they were looking at buying or investing in or lending to your business become quite important for that fact-finding, onboarding piece of the process. Now, once we've got all of that, the system will then generate a business insights report. It's about 55 pages long, and it's a detailed analysis of the business. And I'm going to walk you quickly through one in just a moment. The idea, though, behind delivering that report is two key things. Firstly, most business owners have never been told all of the information that's in the report. Things like sustainable growth rate, things like the non-financial rating and scorecard, things like the key risk metrics that come out of that scorecard. Most business owners are not aware of those key issues. The second thing is it's a 55-page detailed analysis of the business. They've probably never had anything like this before. It concludes with an estimate of the current value, and most importantly, it also concludes with an estimate of what the valuation could be or should be if you go down the road of resolving some of the key issues that we've identified. So let's walk through quickly a business insights report for a typical client, just to understand what the contents are and highlight some of the key deliverables from a client perspective so that they can understand their business even better. The first thing we start with is a strategic overview. That's a really high level scorecard that tells us at a high level, where is the business at? So it'll have an overall score. In the Smith Engineering training client that we use with all of our advisors, the results are C-, so it's pretty average actually. The scoring goes from A+ to E-. This is bang smack in the middle, C-. But what you can see when you look at the scorecards, the financials, the credit score and the benchmarking score are all in the A range. So it's performing quite well from a financial perspective. But the non-financials, the foundation and the strategic growth scorecards are actually in the E range. That's not unusual for most client businesses. But again, that gives us an overall rating. We know where the business is basically at, and we compare apples with apples because that's industry weighted, economy weighted, so different scores if you're in the United States versus Australia or the United Kingdom, but really effective at scoring the business overall in an apples for apples comparison amongst peers, so we can see where we're performing. The next thing we look at is the company structure. Who owns the company? What are the potential tax implications if we were to sell the company or the business or the structure that we're using as our trading vehicle? Then we get into the financials. So firstly, the original financials are presented back to the client. Here's the financials you gave me, exactly as you gave them to me, but reclassified. We've started to classify things, for example, into fixed and variable expenses, non-cash expenses, just so we can do some later analysis. The next thing you'll see is the add backs and adjustments schedule. So all of those things that I spoke about before, like rent or non-market salaries for owners, are all adjusted and added back. And then we get a normalized profit and loss. We get an operations balance sheet and a finance balance sheet. And that's basically a summary of our financial position. Where are we at today? What do our historical financials look like? Once they're added back and adjusted, what does our normalized financials look like? Then we can start doing some really detailed analysis. So the first part of the detailed analysis is a trend analysis. Nearly every buyer I've ever worked with will look at a trend over 4 or 5 years. Has the business grown consistently and smoothly? If it has, that's probably a positive. If, however, our turnover is up and down like a yo-yo every year, drops down, comes back up, drops away again, comes back up again, that's much more unpredictable, and that speaks to higher risk. So everyone will look at a trend analysis. Then we get to a financial scorecard. This gives us firstly a rating. In our Smith Engineering example, that's A-. But we've got various categories where we can see what the actual scores are for each of the ratios that we're analysing. And maybe we've got some negatives here. We've got red crosses. This is a traffic light system. Green ticks, red crosses, orange areas where we're in between or not sure. But we can see straight away on the financial scorecard where we're underperforming. And on the next page, it'll explain why. So if you've got a red cross, for example, in accounts receivable days, it might be because your accounts receivable days are 75, but our target's actually 60. So you can see straight away why you've got that red cross in the particular scorecard. After that, we look at the financial scorecard trend. How's your financial performance varied over 4 or 5 years? Are we getting better or are we getting worse? Or maybe we're not changing at all. So just having a look at that trend helps the buyer understand where we're up to and what we're doing. Then we get into some really detailed financial analysis. So the first thing we do is understand our break even. What's our break even point for this particular business? We also split the costs into fixed and variable and look at the ratio between the two, because that's quite important in terms of managing the business. In case there is a downturn or something goes wrong, what's our safety margin? Right at the bottom of the page and throughout the report, you'll see some of the numbers are highlighted in a blue box. They're the key number on that particular page. So on this page, safety margin is actually the key number. And what we're looking for here is a score better than 5%. Now what that means is if we've got a score of 5%, if our turnover reduces by 5%, we have a problem because we're now no longer above our break-even point. What we'd like to see is a score better than 5 or 10. In this case with Smith Engineering, we've got a break-even point or a safety margin of 30.7%. So we've got plenty of room. It's not a recommendation to drop your turnover by 30%, but it means you've got enough safety margin not to worry about losing one client or one sale. Then we get into cash flow, which again is really important from a buyer's point of view. Firstly, looking at revenue to cash. Where'd the money come from and what did we spend it on to get back to our cash? On the next page, we're then looking at free cash flow. Again, that's the number in light blue at the top of the box. How much free cash is this business actually generating? Because that's the number that a lender, a buyer, or an investor is really want to know. We really want to understand what that number is, because that's the return we're going to get if we acquire this business. On the next page, we're going to look at sustainable growth. Now, this is an unusual metric, but it's a really important one when we're talking to clients. I often have clients come in and say to me, my plan is I'm going to grow this business at 30% per annum for the next 3 years, and then I'm going to sell it, which is a fine strategy, except if your sustainable growth rate is below 30%. So in the example with Smith Engineering, it's only 18%. What that means is I can grow that business, given the current financing structure, at 18%. If I wanted to grow it at 30%, I need to either inject more capital in equity or borrow money. The next page then, as a result of that, looks at your credit risk scorecard. Are you actually able to borrow money? If your strategy is to grow at a rate higher than the sustainable growth rate, are you able to borrow the money to do it? If not, you have to inject some equity. The next section of the report looks at benchmarking. Firstly, what industry are we in? And what's the data saying about that industry? What are the key risks there? What does the growth projection look like going forward? And some basic industry demographics. How many businesses are in this industry in your area? Are they growing? Are they subtracting? How many employees? What's the forward outlook? And what are the key sort of drivers of value in that particular industry? And then we benchmark the business itself. So we benchmark it against industry averages. Is your business performing better or worse than industry averages? That'll help you as an advisor identify for your client where they're over or underperforming. And as a result of that, we then go to the next section, which is profit gap. If, for example, your costs of goods sold is 5% higher than the industry average, it means you've got a profit gap of that 5%. Now, if your turnover is $10 million, that 5% is $500,000 in profit. Literally profit gap, profit you are not getting that you should be. And when you take that through to evaluation, it's quite a lot more than that, obviously, given the multiple. So helping clients identify how they're performing in a benchmarking sense and where they might have a profit gap or more than one profit gap helps really drill down on the financial performance of the business and identify an immediate area for a quick win and an improvement in the financial performance. Once we've done the detailed financial analysis, the next part is to look at the non-financial aspects of the business. And we talked about them in the scorecard at the front. But there's two key things that come out of this. The first one is we're identifying all the key areas of risk or weakness or gaps in the business. Firstly, so we can fix them. When we get to the implementation plan, I'll explain how that works. But secondly, that actually has a very strong impact on the valuation formula. And in fact, the answers to the questions for these non-financial metrics automatically populate the beta scorecard. In other words, it automatically determines what the risk factor is for this particular business. So the first scorecard is foundation. It's all of the basic operational aspects of the business that you should have right. Business model, financial management, compliance, people, and the management team. The 5 sort of key areas that every business should have covered. Unfortunately, in most of our clients, we find lots of gaps. But that's a good thing because we're finding them up front well before we get in front of a buyer or a lender or an investor, and we can do something about addressing them. In the second part of the non-financial scorecard, we've got a strategic growth component. In other words, if you had all of the strategic growth metrics in place, your business would be worth far more than the average competitor. What is your growth model? What's your growth strategy? What structures have you got in place to enable that growth? Have you got, for example, some intangible assets? And if you have, how well are they protected? Have you got export potential and some of the other key growth aspects that strategic buyers are looking at? Now, all of that then goes forward and populates our beta scorecard. And again, that's a scorecard that identifies risk, and it identifies risks under 3 key categories. Firstly, the economy. So foreign exchange, inflation, interest rates. Are they high risk at the moment or low risk? And of course, this is not business specific, it's country specific typically, but it's generic for all clients within that particular economy. Then we get into industry risk, and that's obviously related to the industry that your business operates in. What's the competition spectrum look like? What's the barrier to entry? Some of the other key risks around industry. And lastly, there's 9 categories of company-specific risk. Your business. What's the management team look like? Is the past performance sustainable? What does your risk look like in all those non-operational areas that we've looked at? That all ends up with a risk-weighted score, so we can see how risky is your business compared to all others. That then goes into our valuation calculation. So we use a weighted average cost of capital, and we typically weight our earnings over 3 or 4 years to get a weighted average earnings that then creates that multiple that we can then create a valuation. Now, I often tell people the valuation is sort of an estimate of where you're at today. Most business owners, that's not the end. It's an important number. It's important that they understand what that looks like. And sometimes that's a significant barrier for business owners. If I need $10 million to pay out all my debt and fund retirement, and my business value is $5 million, then I've got a significant gap and probably a big problem. What we also look at after the valuation is actually the guts of the report, the key piece that business owners really want to get involved with. The last couple of pages of the report is actually headed value potential. What our software allows you to do is calculate the potential value of this business given all the data. We've got about 300 data points we use in the report. And so what we're able to do is actually tell you, in the Smith Engineering example, the business is currently valued at $5.3 million. As I said, that's a good starting point, but it's not necessarily the end game for most owners. What the value potential analysis does is shows you how that business could progress in value over a period of time. So if you fix the profit gap and the financial performance, you'll get a jump in value. If you then go in and become best in class financials, and we've got some tools that we use in our 21 steps to help you actually do that, then you get another jump in value. And ultimately, if you go to those non-financial scorecards around foundation, and if all of those red crosses that we identified become green ticks, you'll get a substantial jump in value. And lastly, if you go to the strategic growth scorecard and you've got all of that in place, then you'll get another growth step in value. And in the Smith Engineering report, you'll see the value goes from 5.3 to $9 million. And that jump to $9 million is what clients are most interested about. In the next video, I'm going to talk you through what that jump means, what's the value potential reality, and how do we actually help clients implement and achieve that jump in value.